When I was 7 years old, on January 17th, my birthday, 1961, President Eisenhower made what was probably what today I think I look at as the most important speech in American history. And it was his farewell speech to the nation.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
3 days later, my uncle John Kennedy would take the oath of office, and I would be there, attending that. But Eisenhower gave this wonderful speech in which he warned America against the emergence of a military-industrial complex, a permanent war industry, and an associated federal science technocracy, which he specifically mentioned, would soon emerge if we did not constrain it to dominate American democracy and to rob us of all of our values and all the things that are important about our country. And my uncle quickly realized that Eisenhower had captured the most important issue in our time, and he realized that during the Bay of Pigs invasion, which in the middle of that invasion, he realized that his Joint Chiefs of Staff, who he had trusted, Curtis LeMay and Louis Lemonster, and the CIA, particularly Allen Dulles and Charles Cabell and Richard Bissell, had lied to his face about the invasion, and they had made a series of lies in order to trick him 2.5 months into his presidency into making that invasion when they knew that it would fail, and they believed that he would be embarrassed. He would be a young president, and he would in order to avert the humiliation of that failure, he would call on the United States Navy, and in particular, the aircraft carrier Essex, and he would order air support to topple Castro. And my uncle refused to do that. He refused to send combat troops into Laos, and they already thought he was a traitor. He refused to confront the Russians. He organized a withdrawal of the Russians by contacting Khrushchev directly from the Berlin Wall, from the Checkpoint Charlie conflict. And he refused to send combat troops into Vietnam. And of course, as soon as he died, the intelligence agencies and the Navy concocted a false flag event, essentially called the Tonkin Gulf incident, and used that as a pretext for Americanizing the Vietnam War. And President Eisenhower immediately after that sent 250,000 U.S. troops, and it became an American war. My father then ran against Eisenhower on the war issue, again against the military-industrial complex, and he was killed. In the process, again, the military-industrial complex increased its power. We became more and more a surveillance state at home and a national security state. The next really big change occurred on 9/11, which, we were with the Cold War was over. We were supposed to get a peace dividend. In 1992, the Cold War ended. We were supposed to get a peace dividend, and we were supposed to beat our swords into plowshares. We would stop making, stealth bombers that cost $1 billion and couldn't fly in the rain. And we would put that money into schools, into roads, into police protection, into the environment, and into rebuilding the gutted middle class in this country, and rebuilding the structures and institutions of American democracy. And of course, the peace dividend the next year, we had the first World Trade Center attack. And then the next thing that happened was 9/11. By the end of that decade, we had 888 military bases abroad. That's an imperial nation. And then, of course, and I'd say with the final blow in this coup d'etat against democracy by the military, medical, industrial complex and by the biosecurity agenda was COVID-19. when America really, we got rid of our Bill of Rights. We began using, the government began censoring speech for the first time in American history. And once you censor speech, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, and Adams all said the same thing. We put free expression in the First Amendment because all of the other amendments and rights depend on it. If a government has the right to censor its critics, to silence its critics, it has license for every atrocity. And as soon as they asserted that power successfully to suppress dissent, they then closed all the churches for a year with no scientific citation and no regulatory, process. There was no hearings. There was no environmental impact statement. There was no rationale that anybody could see or challenge in any way that they could do that. And then they got rid of freedom of assembly, which is also in the First Amendment by these social distancing dictates. And then they went after property rights for the Fifth Amendment. They shut down 3.3 million businesses with no due process and no just compensation, in total violation of the Constitution. They then went after jury trials, the Seventh Amendment. They made it so that, they made it so that if you were providing a countermeasure, one of thousands of companies providing vaccines or masks or other countermeasures, PCR tests, no matter how negligent or reckless they behave, you can't sue them. Here's what the Seventh Amendment says: no American shall be deprived the right of a trial before a jury of his peers in cases or controversies exceeding $25 in value. There is no pandemic exception. It says if a corporation hurts you, you get to sue them. But suddenly we couldn't do that anymore. And by the way, the framers of the Constitution knew all about pandemics. There were two pandemics in the Revolutionary War. One of them that disabled, that decimated the Army of Virginia malaria epidemic, and then a smallpox epidemic that disabled and froze at a critical time the Army of New England at the time when we conquered Montreal. So, Benedict Arnold's army took Montreal. Canada today would be part of the United States, except for that, arguably, except for that smallpox epidemic. And then between the time of the end of the Revolution and the passage of the approval of the Bill of Rights and the U.S. Constitution, there were epidemics in every city in our country that killed tens of thousands of people. There was smallpox, there was yellow fever, there was cholera in all of the cities. And yet the framers decided not to put an epidemic exception into the Constitution. We've had much worse tragedies than COVID-19. We had the Civil War that killed 669,000 Americans, the equivalent of like 10 million today. That almost tore our country, destroyed our country. Our country was this close to being decimated. And yet when Lincoln tried to suspend habeas corpus, the Supreme Court said you can't do it. And then during the Spanish flu epidemic, which I think killed 50 million people around the world, it dwarfs the COVID epidemic. We still did not suspend the Constitution. Suddenly it became okay to suspend the Constitution. And that's pretty hard to explain.